To the modern reader, the term Pāli Canon may evoke the image of dusty scrolls, old monks chanting in candlelit halls, or ancient texts tucked away in monasteries across Southeast Asia. Even among practicing Buddhists, the Pāli Canon, or Tipitaka, is often viewed as a sacred library, a source of sermons and moral teachings attributed to the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. But this perception only scratches the surface of what the canon truly is. In truth, the Pāli Canon is not merely a collection of religious scriptures. It is a multidimensional system, a complete spiritual technology that encodes some of the most refined psychological, philosophical, and meditative understandings ever developed by the human mind. Composed over centuries and preserved with astonishing precision through oral transmission before being written down, the canon is not meant to be read in the usual sense. It is designed to be lived, internalized, and realized. What if we told you that the canon was never meant to be an object of blind devotion or intellectual study alone, but rather a step-by-step manual to dismantle the illusion of self, to undo suffering at its very root, and to awaken the mind from its ancient sleep? This story will take you on a journey through the hidden layers of the Pāli Canon. We will uncover the logic of its structure, the radical ideas it conceals in plain sight, the astonishing method of oral transmission that preserved its purity, and the spiritual algorithms embedded within its teachings. As we explore, you will come to see the Tipitaka not as a static religious text, but as a living operating system, one that, when rightly understood and applied, can transform the mind from bondage to liberation. It often surprises people to learn that the Buddha never wrote a single word of what we now call the Pāli Canon. Not one verse, not one instruction, not even a signature. In fact, he deliberately avoided writing down his teachings. In a world that venerates sacred books, scriptures, and divine revelations inscribed on tablets or scrolls, this silence is radical. And yet, it is precisely in this silence, this decision not to write, that we begin to glimpse the genius of the Buddha's method. To understand this, we must first step into the world of 5th century BCE India, a time when oral traditions dominated the landscape of knowledge transmission. Writing existed, yes, but it was not trusted for matters of deep spiritual significance. It was a new and crude technology, barely emerging, and it was far from accessible. Ink on palm leaves could be lost, destroyed, or misread. But the mind, when trained through discipline, repetition, and mindfulness, was a living vault that preserved meaning with astonishing fidelity. The Buddha knew this well. He came from a culture where the most sacred knowledge was never written. It was memorized word for word, tone for tone, sometimes for decades, and passed down through generations of reciters. The Vedic traditions that preceded him relied on this oral precision. But the Buddha's refusal to write was not just cultural, it was strategic. He had no interest in creating a Bible. He had no desire to found a religion centered on belief in a book. His aim was liberation, not documentation. When asked how his teachings should be preserved after his passing, the Buddha made it clear, let the Dhamma and Vinaya be your teacher. He did not designate a successor. He did not write a last testament. Instead, he entrusted the entire path of awakening to a system of living memory. Supported by a community of mindful beings who had experienced the truth of his teachings firsthand. This act was not reckless, it was rooted in a profound understanding of the nature of truth. The Dhamma, in the Buddha's view, was not something that could be captured by ink. It was not a philosophy to be debated, nor a set of dogmas to be believed. It was an experience to be realized. A path to be walked, a process to be lived. To write it down would be to risk turning it into doctrine, into something static, rigid, and dead. And so, the early Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, was trained not only in meditation and ethical conduct but also in precise memorization. Some monks specialized in learning thousands of discourses, suttas. Others mastered the detailed monastic rules of the Vinaya. Still others, in later generations, delved into the deep abstractions of the Abhidhamma. Each monk or nun became a walking library, a living page, a carrier of Dhamma. This system was incredibly robust. Recitation sessions were held regularly. Group chanting ensured that any deviation from the original was corrected immediately. Cross-referencing between different reciters maintained consistency. In time, a formal structure emerged, the three baskets, or Tipitaka, a brilliant classification system that separated the Buddha's teachings into ethical rules, discourses, and psychological analysis. For centuries, the canon remained unwritten. It lived in breath and syllable in the minds of dedicated practitioners. It was not until several hundred years after the Buddha's death, around the 1st century BCE, during a time of war and famine in Sri Lanka, that the teachings were finally committed to writing. The monks feared that the oral lineage might be lost, and so, under the patronage of King Vadagmai, the canon was inscribed onto palm leaves in the Pāli language, preserving what had been transmitted with remarkable accuracy for generations. And yet, something shifted in that moment. The Dhamma, once dynamic and living, became text. The spiritual technology that had once passed from heart to heart now rested between covers. While the writing saved the teachings from potential extinction, it also froze them. The risk now was not loss, but misinterpretation. Readers would take words at face value, mistaking metaphor for doctrine, process for belief. The canon became a revered object, but in doing so, its original purpose began to fade from view. Why did the Buddha never write anything down? Because he understood that truth cannot be owned. It cannot be captured in symbols, only pointed to. Like a raft, it must be used to cross the river, not carried on one's back forever. A written text invites clinging. An oral teaching demands presence, attention, and direct experience. By preserving his teachings through the living mind, the Buddha ensured that the Dhamma would remain what it was meant to be, not a scripture to be worshipped, but a path to be walked. Thus, the birth of the Pāli Canon was not the beginning of a religion. It was the unfolding of a living system of liberation, a technology of the spirit, a map that could only be followed by those who understood that the words were not the destination, but the finger pointing to the moon. To modern minds, trained in the convenience of books, smartphones, and searchable databases, the idea of memorizing tens of thousands of words seems impossible, almost mythic. How could anyone, let alone an entire community, preserve an immense body of spiritual teachings purely through memory? And yet, this is exactly what the early Buddhist Sangha did. For nearly 5 centuries. Before a single word of the Pāli Canon was ever written down, its entirety was carried in the minds and voices of dedicated practitioners. But this was no ordinary memory. It was a refined, engineered art, a technology of remembrance. The term Bahasaka, which appears repeatedly in the canon, means having heard much or possessing great learning. But its literal meaning is more direct, one who has heard a lot. In a culture where knowledge was auditory, to hear was to know, and to remember was to preserve truth. From the moment a novice entered the Sangha, their mind was gradually sculpted into a vessel for preservation. Memorization was not a side task, it was central to the path. Chanting, repetition, internalization, and recitation became as essential as meditation itself. The structure of the Pāli Canon was brilliantly suited to this method. Unlike modern books, it was not designed for silent reading. It was composed for oral transmission, for communal chanting, and for precise retention. The Buddha and his senior disciples used rhythmic phrasing, repetition of key patterns, and formulaic expressions to imprint the teachings deep into the memory of listeners. One might encounter the same phrase. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. Dozens, even hundreds of times throughout the canon. To the untrained eye, this appears redundant. But to the memory, it is the perfect design. In fact, the repetition was not accidental, it was pedagogical. It turned the teachings into chants, mantras, mental loops. The rhythm of Dhamma was embedded not just in the content, but in the form. This was the secret behind the Sangha's ability to preserve hundreds of thousands of lines with little variation. It was a system built on oral precision, designed for the human mind before the age of ink and paper. Even more astonishing was the collective nature of this memory. In early Buddhist councils, like the first council held shortly after the Buddha's passing, hundreds of monks gathered to recite the teachings together. Mahakassapa, one of the Buddha's most respected disciples, led the assembly. Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant, recited the discourses, beginning each with the now famous phrase, Eva me Sutta, thus have I heard. Upali recited the monastic code. Their recitations were affirmed by the community through group memory. If one faltered, the others corrected. If there was divergence, the Sangha would deliberate and agree on the most accurate form. This was not just memory. It was collective intelligence, a living network of minds synchronized in truth. Monks became specialists. Some mastered the Sutta Pitaka, the vast collection of discourses. Others memorized the Vinaya Pitaka, the intricate code of monastic discipline. Still others, in later centuries, turned to the Abhidhamma Pitaka, an abstract psychological system that dissected the nature of experience into minute, interdependent elements. Each specialist contributed to the integrity of the whole. Together, they formed a distributed system of knowledge more durable than any single manuscript. It is crucial to understand that this oral tradition was not passive. It was not simply about repeating words. Reciters had to understand what they were transmitting. The Buddha emphasized panna, wisdom, as the cornerstone of the path. Thus, memory was married to insight. To recite the Dhamma was to live it, embody it, test it in practice. The memorizer was also the practitioner. There was no room for hollow parroting. The mind that remembered was the mind that reflected, contemplated, and realized. In this sense, the oral tradition was not a weakness of the early canon. It was its greatest strength. Far from being primitive, it represented a level of mental training that modern culture has almost entirely lost. In place of bookshelves, they had silence. In place of bookmarks, they had mindfulness. In place of external storage, they had internal realization. What they preserved was not merely the letter of the Dhamma, but its spirit, its pulse, its breath, its transformative power. And perhaps most importantly, this oral tradition shaped the very way the teachings were understood. Without the ability to flip back through pages or search for key terms, practitioners had to internalize whole teachings, entire suttas, and patterns of thought. This nurtured a kind of wisdom that was structural, not superficial. The mind became fluent in the architecture of Dhamma, not just its slogans, but its system. So when we hold the Pāli Canon today, be it in printed form, digital format, or translated editions, we are not merely reading ancient scriptures. We are touching the echoes of a vast oral symphony, a living memory passed from voice to voice, breath to breath, for centuries. We are witnessing the mind of the early Sangha, refined, disciplined, vibrantly alive, committed not just to the preservation of words, but to the transmission of awakening itself. They were not scribes. They were not priests. They were memory masters. And they carried a technology more enduring than stone, the code of liberation, alive and sound. The Pāli Canon, also known as the Tipitaka, is often approached today like a vast, ancient library, dense, sacred, and overwhelming. Thousands of pages, hundreds of discourses, countless rules and classifications. For many modern readers, it seems like a disjointed mosaic of teachings scattered across cryptic texts and archaic language. But hidden beneath this surface is a breathtaking design, intentional, elegant, and profound. Far from being a random collection, the Tipitaka is a precisely engineered system. And its true genius is not in its quantity, but in its architecture. The name Tipitaka means 3 baskets. These are not poetic categories. They are structural containers, each holding a distinct aspect of the Buddha's method. When seen rightly, they function like the 3 integrated components of a machine, each turning in harmony with the others to produce a single outcome, the awakening of the mind. The first basket is the Vinaya Pitaka, the collection of monastic discipline. At first glance, this appears to be little more than a set of rules. Don't lie, don't steal, don't touch money, don't eat after noon. But this basket is far deeper than it seems. The Vinaya is the behavioral engine of the canon. It is a system for engineering external conduct in such a way that the inner mind becomes fertile ground for liberation. Every rule, every guideline, is rooted in cause and effect. The goal is not obedience, but transformation. Through restraint and mindfulness in daily life, the Vinaya weakens defilements like greed, pride, and delusion long before the meditator even sits down on a cushion. The second basket is the Sutta Pitaka, the discourses of the Buddha and his great disciples. This is the heart of the canon's spoken wisdom. In these suttas, we find the voice of a teacher not merely instructing, but guiding the listener through a process of awakening. These teachings are dialogical, practical, and targeted. They speak to monks, lay people, kings, courtesans, murderers, skeptics, and ascetics. Some are short and direct. Others unfold like philosophical tapestries. But all of them serve one purpose: to help the mind see reality clearly. The Sutta Pitaka is the cognitive engine of the Tipitaka. It reshapes perception, breaks illusions, and redirects attention from craving to insight. The third basket is the Abhidhamma Pitaka, often called the higher teaching. For many, this is the most obscure section of the canon, filled with exhaustive classifications of mental states, consciousness moments, and experiential phenomena. But behind this analytic density is a unique gift, the diagnostic engine of the system. The Abhidhamma lays bare the mechanics of the mind at an atomic level. It shows, not by metaphor but by detailed mapping, how thoughts arise, how emotions form, and how intentions condition experience. It is not meant to be read casually. It is meant to train the mind to observe with surgical clarity until the illusion of a permanent self begins to unravel on its own. Together, these three baskets form a triadic system, like three gears turning in unison. The Vinaya tames the body and speech, creating ethical stillness. The Suttas feed the intellect and heart, fostering right view. The Abhidhamma refines observation, slicing through the subtlest patterns of delusion. When practiced together, they produce not belief, but change, not obedience, but awakening. This is the secret many modern readers miss. The Tipitaka was not meant to be read in isolation or piecemeal. It is not a textbook, and it is not a sermon. It is a multidimensional training protocol. The rules are not arbitrary, they shape behavior to protect meditative depth. The discourses are not just inspirational, they are prescriptions for shifts in perception. The psychological classifications are not academic, they are tools for insight into mind-matter dynamics. Each basket points to a different function, but all three aim at one result: the end of suffering. Even more astonishing is how the structure of the Tipitaka reflects the path itself. The Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, is mirrored in the design of the canon. Vinaya trains right action, speech, and livelihood. The Suttas teach right view and intention. The Abhidhamma sharpens right mindfulness and concentration. All are supported by right effort. The canon is the Eightfold Path, written across three dimensions of text. No one stumbles upon this structure by accident. It reveals itself only to those who approach the canon not as a scholar, but as a practitioner, someone using the text to illuminate their own experience. It is not a religion to believe, but a tool to apply. Just as a physician does not worship a medical textbook, but uses it to heal the body, the spiritual seeker must learn to use the Tipitaka to diagnose and dismantle suffering. Seen from this perspective, the Pāli Canon is not outdated, it is futuristic. It anticipates a kind of internal engineering that the modern world is only beginning to rediscover. In the age of brain science, mindfulness apps, and psychological therapy, the Tipitaka remains vastly ahead, mapping the terrain of the inner world with precision, patience, and compassion. Three baskets, one engine, one result: awakening. But this engine does not run on faith. It runs on experience. And for it to operate, the teachings must move from the page to the heart, from the intellect to the direct knowing of reality. The canon was not designed to be admired, it was designed to be used. In the chapters to come, we will look more closely at how the contents of these baskets function as living instructions, especially in the Suttas, where the Buddha's words often hide spiritual algorithms disguised as simple parables. To the casual reader, the Buddha's discourses, called suttas, might seem like simple moral lessons or spiritual aphorisms, repeated endlessly in different formats. One might see familiar themes: suffering and its cessation, impermanence, compassion, non-self. But for those who look deeper, with the eyes of a practitioner rather than a scholar, something extraordinary emerges. The suttas are not sermons. They are not philosophy. They are spiritual algorithms, step-by-step cognitive instructions designed to rewire the mind from delusion to awakening. Consider how algorithms work in computing. They are sequences of precise instructions that, when followed, produce a specific result. The Buddha's suttas operate in exactly this way. When recited, contemplated, and practiced in the order and spirit in which they are given, they create transformations in consciousness. Like code running silently beneath the surface, they perform operations, stripping away ignorance, dissolving ego, cutting the roots of craving. And like any well-crafted algorithm, they are modular, recursive, and astonishingly efficient. Let us take a seemingly simple example, the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the four foundations of mindfulness. On the surface, it appears as a basic meditation guide. Observe the body. Observe feelings, observe mind, observe mental objects. But beneath this surface lies an elegant looped structure. Each section includes instructions for observing phenomena as they are, in terms of arising, passing away, and the process in between. The meditator is taught not to intervene, not to suppress, not to grasp, just to see, again and again, with unwavering honesty. This repeated seeing triggers a silent computation. Each loop, through the observation, weakens the habitual delusion that I am the body, or this feeling is mine. The practitioner is led through a process of de-identification, gradually eroding the default view that the self is a solid, continuous entity. Over time, perception recalibrates. The world, once filtered through ego and craving, begins to be seen as it truly is, impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. The Satipatthana Sutta is not just a text, it is a deprogramming routine. The same can be seen in the Anattallakkhika Sutta, the discourse on the characteristic of not-self. This was one of the Buddha's earliest teachings, given to the first group of enlightened monks. He doesn't argue or philosophize. He presents a series of inquiries. Is the body permanent or impermanent? What is impermanent? Does it lead to suffering or happiness? What is impermanent and suffering? Should it be regarded as mine, I, or myself? Then he applies the same structure to feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. 5 questions, 5 components, 1 loop, 1 insight. The mind is gently but firmly walked through a chain of reasoning that leads to a radical conclusion. There is no immutable self in any of these processes. This is not just philosophy, it is structured contemplation, designed to deliver a moment of insight when the loop completes. And for many monks who heard it, it did just that. Other suttas operate like diagnostic tools. The Sabbasava Sutta, for example, outlines 7 methods to remove mental defilements, asava, by seeing, by restraining, by using, by enduring, by avoiding, by removing, and by developing. Each is an instruction. Each addresses a different type of psychological block. It is not a list of virtues, it is a targeted toolbox. The practitioner is expected to recognize defilements in real time and apply the correct strategy. This is dynamic, not theoretical. It is applied inner science. Even the Jataka stories, tales of the Buddha's past lives, function as more than folklore. While many appear moralistic on the surface, each contains symbolic code. The characters represent aspects of the psyche. The dilemmas reflect the struggle between desire, fear, and wisdom. And the resolution always points back to the cultivation of the mind. These are parables, yes, but parables designed not to entertain, but to implant deep structures of discernment in the unconscious. They are ancient thought forms that condition ethical intuition over time. It is no coincidence that the Buddha repeatedly emphasized yoniso manasikara, wise attention. He knew that what the mind repeatedly reflects on becomes its default pattern. The suttas are crafted to train attention to loop through Dhamma again and again until wisdom is no longer something learned but something seen. These are algorithms of direct experience. The language is simple not because the ideas are simple, but because the instructions must be clear for the mind to follow them without resistance. Modern psychology and neuroscience are beginning to catch up to this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and even trauma recovery methods now use similar structures. Identify the pattern, bring mindful awareness, observe without judgment, change the relationship to the thought or feeling. Yet these modern discoveries were embedded in the suttas over 500 years ago, hidden in plain sight. But there is a catch. These algorithms do not run on mere reading. You cannot understand them with intellect alone. You must enter them. You must apply them. Reflect on them. Sit with them in silence. Like software that requires a specific operating system, the suttas require a mind that is ethically grounded, collected, and attentive. Without this foundation, the teachings become ideas. With it, they become transformation. This is why, in traditional Buddhist cultures, chanting and recitation are not mere rituals. They are forms of practice. When a monk chants the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the discourse on turning the wheel of Dhamma, he is not just preserving words. He is activating a code. He is rehearsing a cycle of realization that leads from ignorance to knowledge, from knowledge to dispassion, from dispassion to release. It is an invocation of awakening, not in a mystical sense, but in a neurological, experiential one. To see the suttas in this light changes everything. It removes them from the dusty shelf of sacred literature and places them in the living space of spiritual practice. It makes the Tipitaka not a book to be revered, but a manual to be executed. Each sutta becomes a gateway, a script written in the language of liberation. But for any system to be reliable, its foundation must be stable. And this is where the next layer of spiritual engineering comes in, the Vinaya, not merely a set of rules, but a behavioral protocol that ensures the mind stays steady as the algorithms of awakening do their work. To outsiders, the Vinaya Pitaka may appear as the driest, most rigid part of the Pāli Canon. It is a dense body of rules, procedures, and regulations, covering everything from how to wear robes, to where to relieve oneself, to how to handle disputes in the monastic community. Compared to the inspiring tone of the suttas or the philosophical depth of the Abhidhamma, the Vinaya seems legalistic and overly concerned with monastic minutiae. But this view misses its genius. For beneath its apparent austerity lies a radical insight. The outer shapes the inner. The mind is not an isolated organ floating in a vacuum of pure thought. It is embedded in habits, postures, speech, environment, and social interaction. Every action, even the smallest, conditions the mind. Therefore, to train the mind, one must first shape the conditions around it. This is the purpose of the Vinaya, to create an external ecosystem of simplicity, restraint, and awareness that supports internal freedom. Take, for instance, the rule that prohibits eating after noon. At first glance, it may seem arbitrary or even harsh, but in reality, it is a subtle intervention into the machinery of desire. By limiting food intake to a narrow window of time, the rule reduces bodily heaviness, sharpens alertness, and most importantly, forces the practitioner to confront craving directly. Hunger becomes not a problem to solve, but a sensation to observe. The monk learns to dwell in discomfort without reacting, a skill that becomes essential in meditation, where the mind must sit still even as restlessness, pain, or boredom arise. Or consider the rule of celibacy, one of the core commitments of monastic life. This is not a denial of pleasure for its own sake. It is a precise decision to remove one of the most potent sources of attachment, fantasy, and emotional entanglement. By withdrawing from sensual engagement, the monk redirects energy inward. The nervous system becomes less agitated. The heart becomes less entangled. The clarity needed to see anatta, the truth of not-self, begins to emerge. Again, it is not morality for morality's sake. It is behavior designed for transformation. Even the rules of robe-wearing have psychological power. Monks are taught to wear simple garments, of plain color, stitched from discarded cloth. Why? Because appearance reinforces identity. When one dresses to impress, the ego inflates. When one wears only what is needed, the self-image dissolves. Simplicity becomes a mirror, in its reflection. The practitioner sees how much of their suffering is self-created. The Vinaya also engineers social behavior. It regulates how monks speak, how they criticize one another, how they resolve conflict, how they confess faults. Gossip, harsh speech, and even sarcasm are discouraged. Why? Because words are actions. The Buddha recognized that the Sangha, the community of practitioners, was not merely a group of individuals, but a living organism. If its members engaged in toxic behavior, the group would become unstable. The Vinaya is the immune system of this organism. It prevents infection by craving, anger, and delusion at both individual and collective levels. And it was flexible. Contrary to popular belief, the Vinaya was not rigid dogma. The Buddha allowed certain rules to be added or relaxed depending on context. He understood apply as skillful means. What mattered was not blind adherence, but the function. Does this rule reduce suffering? Does it support the path? If so, it stays. If not, it can be reviewed. This adaptive logic gave the Vinaya its enduring strength across cultures and centuries. Moreover, the rules were not imposed by command. They arose from real-life situations. A monk misbehaves, steals, lies, touches money, and a rule is established in response. The Vinaya texts record these moments in vivid detail, often with humor and humility. The Buddha did not sit in a tower dictating law. He responded with clarity and compassion to the actual needs of the community. Each rule is a lesson, a story about cause and effect, intention and consequence. In this way, the Vinaya becomes not a prison but a training ground. It is the scaffolding within which the spiritual edifice is built. By constraining behavior, it liberates the mind. By removing distractions, it makes space for mindfulness. By regulating speech, it fosters silence. And in silence, wisdom takes root. The modern world often resists such discipline. We prize freedom, spontaneity, and self-expression. But we forget, freedom without structure leads to chaos. Spontaneity without clarity leads to confusion. The Buddha's insight was that the path to true freedom passes through the gate of ethical restraint. Only when the mind is no longer pulled by every impulse can it begin to see clearly. This is why, in the traditional monastic path, Vinaya comes first. Before one masters jhana, meditative absorption, or penetrates the Abhidhamma, or teaches others, one must be established in sila, ethical conduct. Without it, the higher trainings rest on a shaky foundation. With it, they flourish like seeds in fertile soil. And this is not just a lesson for monks. Lay practitioners, too, can take inspiration from this behavioral engineering. Simplifying life, keeping precepts, reducing sensory input, managing speech, these are not restrictions. They are preparations. They create the conditions in which insight can arise. The Buddha's method was not built on belief, but on design. He engineered a path where outer simplicity supports inner freedom, where discipline leads to joy, and where restraint opens the door to liberation. The Vinaya is that blueprint, ancient, austere, and deeply compassionate. But as the centuries rolled on, and the teachings spread far beyond the immediate disciples of the Buddha, a new challenge emerged: how to preserve this living system, this oral, ethical, meditative engine, across generations, cultures, and continents. The answer would come through something both unexpected and astonishing: the transition from sound to script, the moment when the Dhamma was finally written down. For over 4 centuries after the Buddha's passing, his words were not written down. The Pāli Canon, this immense body of teachings we now associate with books, manuscripts, and scriptures, was preserved entirely through human memory. In a time before printing presses, before paper, even before ink became widespread, the Dhamma moved through the world as sound. It lived in voices, in vibrations of air, in recitation shared between teacher and disciple. It was not read, it was remembered. But why? Why would a tradition so concerned with precision and clarity entrust its entire transmission to the fragile medium of memory? Because the Dhamma is not static knowledge. It is experience. The early disciples knew that writing, for all its convenience, could turn the living flame of wisdom into cold ash. When a truth is written down, it risks becoming something one reads about, not something one sees directly. The oral tradition, by contrast, ensured that the teachings were always passed from heart to heart, through the living presence of awakened or deeply trained minds. It was a transmission not just of content, but of context, tone, rhythm, and intent. This is why early monks trained their memory with extraordinary discipline. They memorized suttas, not as rote learners, but as guardians of rhythm and meaning. The teachings were composed in repetitive, rhythmic structures, designed not for books, but for chanting. Refrains, triads, and stock phrases were not signs of laziness. They were mnemonic technologies. Every pattern, every repetition, reinforced memory. Listening to Dhamma was like listening to a song or mantra. Over time, it entered the bloodstream. Yet memory alone is not infallible. The early Sangha recognized this. Thus, they developed a powerful method of collective recitation. Suttas were not transmitted by individual monks working alone, but by groups of monks reciting together, correcting one another in real time. This practice, still alive in some monasteries today, acted like an organic verification system. If one monk forgot a word or phrase, others would notice. The sutta would snap back into alignment. But even such a robust system had its vulnerabilities. As Buddhism spread across India and beyond, and as wars, famines, and political instability shook the monastic world, the threat of loss grew real. And then, in Sri Lanka, Around 100 BCE, the moment arrived. A great famine ravaged the island. Thousands of monks perished. With them, the oral chain of Dhamma transmission began to fracture. The living memory of the canon was in danger of dying out. It was then that the saga made a momentous decision, one that would shape Buddhist history forever. On the island of Sri Lanka, in a place called Aluvihara, a group of elder monks gathered. They took quill and palm leaf, and for the first time in history, they began to write down the Pāli Canon. It was not a casual act. It was revolutionary. They knew that by freezing the Dhamma into script, something would be lost. The oral culture, with its living warmth, could never be fully captured by ink. But they also knew that if they did not act, all might be lost. The Dhamma would vanish from the earth. So they wrote, not as scribes, but as protectors of a vanishing oral world. This first writing of the Tipitaka was a labor of devotion, not merely of scholarship. Every letter carved into palm leaves was an act of preservation. The monks likely worked by firelight, chanting as they wrote, each sutta drawn from memory, then checked against collective recitation. The process took years. But what emerged was unprecedented: a full scriptural canon, organized, categorized, and preserved in Pali, the closest living language to the speech of the Buddha himself. This transition from sound to script transformed Buddhism. The teachings could now be copied, studied, and spread far beyond the monastic halls of India and Sri Lanka. From these palm leaf manuscripts, copies were carried to Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and eventually to the West. The Tipitaka became a bridge across time and geography. But with this transition came a subtle danger. Once written down, the Dhamma could be misunderstood as mere text, as something to be interpreted intellectually, debated, or even wielded for power. Some would begin to treat the canon as a sacred object rather than a transformative path. Others would cut and paste from it to build new systems, sometimes in ways that obscured its original design. This risk, the early elders knew, could not be avoided. But they also knew that the true Dhamma could never be confined to words. The canon was only the vehicle. What mattered was how it was used. A sutta on a palm leaf was no different from a map. It pointed to something beyond itself. Just as reading a recipe is not the same as tasting the dish, reading a sutta is not the same as seeing the truth it describes. The real Dhamma begins where words end. Still, the fact that we have access to these teachings today, thousands of years later, is due entirely to that single act of devotion. In Aluvihara, the teachings that once passed breath to breath were transferred from the realm of sound to the realm of form. And through that form, the breath of the Buddha continues. Even today, in quiet monasteries and forest hermitages across Asia, monks gather to recite the Pali texts. They do not always understand every word, but the rhythm, the tone, the vibration, it connects them to a lineage not broken, only transformed. In a sense, the canon is still alive, not in ink, but in voice. Not just in books, but in living minds. In our time, where digital text and searchable databases make the Dhamma accessible with a keystroke, it's easy to forget the sacrifice, discipline, and genius that made this possible. The Tipitaka is not just a book. It is a miracle of preservation, a gift from voices long silent, still echoing with the sound of awakening. But even more than preservation, it is a system, a spiritual technology. And to understand how it works as a whole, we must look at its internal logic, how all its parts interconnect into a map of the human condition, and how the canon becomes not just a record of the Dhamma, but a machine for generating awakening itself. At first glance, the Pāli Canon may seem like an enormous library, a dusty vault of ancient wisdom, full of lists, sermons, rules, stories, and metaphysical analysis. But to those who live with it, study it, and practice within its structure, the canon reveals itself as something far more profound. It is not just a record. It is not even just a guide. The Pāli Canon is a spiritual technology, a deliberately designed system whose parts work together to produce a single outcome, the irreversible awakening of the human mind. Just as a machine has interlocking components, gears, circuits, inputs and outputs, so too does the Tipitaka. The Vinaya, the Sutta, and the Abhidhamma are not separate silos. They are interdependent modules. The Vinaya engineers behavior and social dynamics. The Suttas program the mind through direct teachings, stories, and experiential algorithms. and the Abhidhamma deconstructs the mind's processes into their elemental functions, providing a map of consciousness itself. Together, they form a complete technology of liberation. This trifold structure is deliberate. If one studies only the suttas without grounding in Vinaya, their insights may remain theoretical or worse, get hijacked by ego. If one studies the Abhidhamma without experiential knowledge of sutta practice, the mind risks becoming overly intellectual, detached from reality. But when the three baskets are practiced together, when ethical behavior supports meditative insight, and meditative insight deepens into precise understanding of mind and matter, the entire system begins to function like a machine whose output is nibbana. Let us look at how this system operates in practice. A practitioner begins with sila, ethical conduct. This is rooted in the Vinaya for monastics, or the 5 or 8 precepts for lay followers. Why start here? Because ethical conduct calms the turbulence of remorse, guilt, fear, and social chaos. A mind that lies, steals, or harms cannot concentrate. Sila aligns outer behavior with inner values. It is like leveling the foundation before constructing a temple. Without it, nothing stable can be built. From this ethical base, the practitioner engages samadhi, concentration, and collectedness. Here, the suttas offer methods like mindfulness of breathing, anapanasati, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, satipana, or loving-kindness, metta. These practices quiet the mind, reveal its patterns, and create mental clarity. Concentration is not escape, it is stabilization. A concentrated mind becomes capable of seeing reality as it is. And it is at this stage that panna, wisdom, begins to blossom. This is where the system deepens into its most radical potential. Insight, vipassana, is not just thinking about impermanence. It is seeing impermanence directly, in real time, in the rise and fall of sensations, thoughts, and awareness itself. The suttas repeatedly emphasize this progression, sila samadhi panna. It is the operating sequence of the liberation algorithm. But where does the Abhidhamma come in? The Abhidhamma Pāli is like the source code of the mind. It breaks experience down into irreducible components, called Dhamma, and shows how they arise and pass away based on conditions. What seems like a single moment of thought is, under Abhidhamma analysis, a rapid chain of mental events, contact, perception, feeling, intention, attention. This deconstruction reveals that there is no single, solid self behind experience, just processes conditioned by prior processes. To the untrained mind, this analysis may seem cold or abstract. But to a practitioner who has experienced insight through meditation, the Abhidhamma becomes a tool of precise diagnosis. It helps name and categorize experiences. It shows the exact mental defilements, kilesa, that are present, and the antidotes needed to uproot them. In this way, it works like a neural debugger, allowing the mind to examine itself, identify faults, and purify its operating system. And this is the key. The Pāli Canon is not content to describe suffering. It offers a functional architecture for ending it. This is where its technological nature becomes most clear. In modern terms, we might compare the canon to an open-source operating system for consciousness. Its principles are transparent. Its logic is repeatable. Its tools are available to all. There are no hidden mysteries, only practices that, when followed with integrity and precision, produce specific results. Just as gravity pulls all objects downward regardless of belief, the Dhamma operates on natural laws, dhamma-niyama, that govern mind and matter. The Buddha himself discouraged blind faith. He compared his teachings to a raft. Use it to cross the river, then let it go. He never asked disciples to worship the texts. He asked them to verify the teachings through direct experience. This is the heart of spiritual technology. It is empirical. It must work in practice, not just in theory. And work it does. The historical record is clear, from the Buddha's time onward. Thousands of practitioners reached stages of awakening through this system. They were not mystics lost in symbols, they were engineers of the spirit, using the Dhamma as a framework to dismantle craving, delusion, and fear. Even the layout of the canon reflects this functionality. Suttas are grouped thematically and numerically for easy memorization. Each set of teachings builds upon the last, basic principles first, then deeper insights. It is like a layered architecture. Beginner modules, e.g., generosity, precepts, intermediate modules, e.g., mindfulness, concentration, and advanced modules, e.g., dependent origination, emptiness, non-self. Moreover, the system is modular and scalable. A layperson in the world can apply basic ethical and meditative practices. A monk in solitude can push into the depths of jhana and insight. The same principles apply at all levels. The system meets you where you are. This is the brilliance of its design. But a machine, however elegant, is only as useful as the person who operates it. And this is the final beauty of the Tipitaka. It is not a passive machine. It is interactive. It evolves with your practice. The deeper your meditation, the deeper the texts reveal their meaning. The more you refine your conduct, the more subtle teachings become available. The canon is like a mirror that reflects your mind, but also a tool that reshapes it. We often imagine ancient spiritual texts as relics, frozen in time, sacred but inert. But the Pāli Canon is not frozen. It is alive. Its circuits are not silicon but Sutta, Vinaya, and Abhidhamma. Its power source is not electricity, but right effort. And its output is not worldly success, but liberation from suffering. We do not worship this machine. We enter it. We follow its pathways. And slowly, we find ourselves being rebuilt, not into something new, but into what we always were beneath the dust, beings capable of awakening. This was the Buddha's gift. Not a religion, not a creed, not a culture, but a system. A spiritual technology with one purpose only, to end suffering by awakening wisdom. And that system, preserved against all odds, still runs quietly, precisely, brilliantly in the minds of those who practice it today. It is easy to imagine that the Pāli Canon belongs to the past. Its words are ancient, its setting distant, its language foreign. It speaks of monks in forests, beggars in ropes, kings in elephant-drawn chariots, and gods who dwell in the clouds. In a world of digital networks and artificial intelligence, of space travel and quantum mechanics, what place could a 500-year-old oral scripture possibly have? Yet this assumption misses the secret of the canon's endurance. The Pāli Canon is not a fossil, it is a framework for awakening. And awakening, freedom from suffering, from fear, from delusion, is not bound by time, place, or culture. It is a human possibility that remains as urgent today as it was under the Bodhi tree. Indeed, in an age of overstimulation, mental fragmentation, and existential anxiety, the insights of the canon are not just relevant, they are vital. We now live in a world flooded with data, but starving for wisdom. We have access to all the world's knowledge at our fingertips, and yet the inner mind remains largely untrained, undisciplined, and misunderstood. The human condition, birth, aging, loss, death, desire, confusion, has not changed. What the Buddha diagnosed still afflicts us, and what he prescribes still cures. What makes the Pāli Canon radical, even today, is that it offers not just ideas, but instructions. It doesn't ask for belief. It offers a sequence of experiments. Follow these steps, and you will see for yourself. You will uncover patterns of craving, habits of mind, layers of perception that hide the truth. You will come to see how the mind creates its own prison, and how, with patience and effort, it can walk out of that prison, door by door. In this way, the canon is not meant to be worshipped but used. It is not a doctrine to be defended, but a lens to see through. The future of the Pāli Canon depends not on scholars preserving its texts in archives or temples chanting its verses in ceremony, but on living beings engaging it with sincerity. Its future lies in practice, not preservation. And this is already happening, all over the world, in unexpected places. The Tipitaka is being rediscovered, not just in monasteries, but in urban centers, meditation apps, psychology labs, and therapy rooms. Neuroscientists study mindfulness. Psychologists apply insight into impermanence and craving. Ethical technologists look to Buddhist precepts to guide AI development. These are not superficial appropriations, they are signs that the Dhamma is adapting. Not changing in essence, but changing in expression. Yet for all this modern adaptation, something crucial is often missing: the systemic integrity of the canon. Many people encounter only fragments, mindfulness here, compassion there, perhaps a quote from the Dhammapada on a coffee mug. But without understanding the structure behind these teachings, the precise logic of dependent origination, the rigor of sila, the deep phenomenology of Abhidhamma, these fragments can become like scattered parts of a machine, disconnected from their function. This is why the canon still matters in full. It is not just a collection of wise sayings. It is a system of interdependent principles. If you follow its structure, it will transform you. If you only take bits and pieces, the power remains dormant. Imagine trying to run only part of a program on your computer. It might look impressive, but it will never perform its intended function. And what is the intended function of this great machine? To dismantle suffering, not to suppress it, not to escape it, but to understand it completely and through understanding, to uproot its cause. This is the path of real freedom, not just political freedom or financial freedom or emotional self-expression, but liberation from the illusion of a separate, permanent self. This is the revolution the Buddha began, and the Pāli Canon is its blueprint. So what does the future hold? Ironically, the Pāli Canon may become more important as technology advances, as virtual reality blurs the line between self and simulation, as neuroscience explores consciousness. As people begin to question what it even means to be human, the teachings of the canon offer a timeless perspective. Consciousness is not who we are, but a process to be understood. Identity is not a fixed truth, but a series of conditioned habits. The self is not lost. It was never solid to begin with. This insight, radical in any era, is the key to a sane future. Moreover, as crises mount, climate collapse, social fragmentation, mental health epidemics, more and more people will turn inward. They will seek clarity. They will want tools, not dogmas. And when they do, the Tipitaka will be waiting, not as an answer book, but as a system for inquiry, not as a tradition, but as a technology of mind. But there is one final truth to this. The canon will not save us. It has never been the role of texts to awaken beings. Texts are scaffolding. They can guide, support, illuminate, but they cannot walk the path for us. That, the Buddha made clear, is something each person must do for themselves. This is the hidden power and hidden challenge of the Pāli Canon. It puts the responsibility back in your hands. It says, here's the map. Here are the tools. The work is yours. So its future, its real future, is not on paper, not even in digitized texts or libraries. Its future is in your mind, your breath, your actions. Every moment of mindfulness, every act of compassion, every insight into the impermanent nature of things, you become the living canon. You become the voice through which these ancient teachings still speak. The monks who carved the Tipitaka onto palm leaves knew this. The disciples who memorized it by heart knew this. Even the Buddha himself, who never wrote a single word, knew this. The Dhamma is not what you read. It is what you realize. And as long as there is even one being willing to test the teachings, willing to sit, breathe, observe, and see deeply, the canon lives on. Not as scripture, but as truth embodied. The Pāli Canon began not as a book, but as a living memory, transmitted breath to breath, heart to heart, from awakened beings to earnest seekers. It survived centuries not by accident, but through devotion, discipline, and a profound understanding that words alone are not the Dhamma. The Dhamma must be lived. We have journeyed through its creation from the first council's solemn effort to preserve not the Buddha's opinions, but his precise realizations, to the development of its threefold structure. Vinaya, Sutta, and Abhidhamma, each a pillar supporting a system of awakening. We've explored how it functions not as doctrine, but as technology, where ethical codes stabilize life. Meditation trains perception, and wisdom dismantles the illusion of self. We've seen how the canon's continued relevance lies not in its age, but in its design. It is a framework for liberation that transcends time and culture. It does not ask for blind belief. It invites you to test, to question, to experience. In a world dominated by belief systems that often divide, the Pāli Canon offers something rare, a system that frees. But now comes the final question, the one no text can answer. What will you do with this knowledge? You who have heard the story, who have glimpsed the depth of this ancient system, will you let it remain a story? Or will you, too, pick up the thread? Because in the end, the canon is not something that sits on a shelf. It is not ancient or modern. It is not even Buddhist in the way we often use that term. It is simply the articulation of truth, how things are, and how suffering, once understood, can be ended. The Buddha's final words were not, worship me. They were not, follow my book. They were, Apamadina Sampadetha. With diligence, work out your own liberation. That is the true ending of the Pāli Canon, and the true beginning of your path.